So in this final lecture, I want to talk more about the theory of apologetics and the way we use narratives, but I want also to begin to be much more practical and ask, how do we actually do this? And I want to make a distinction, which I'm sure many of you will know, but it is actually quite an important one, and that is apologetics as an art and as a science. There are very clear parallels here with other disciplines, like, for example, you think of medicine. I mean, again, you think of that as both an art and a science. It is a science, medicine, because it's all about how you understand the human body and how drugs work, so that's a science. But of course, there's more to medicine than simply knowing about bodies and drugs. It's also about being able to relate to your patients. It's about encouraging them to gain confidence in you. It's about, in effect, developing a relationship so that they will trust you throughout the healing process. And what I want to suggest to you is that apologetics also is very much like that. Actually, while on the one hand you are trying to get a very good grasp of the Christian faith and of various responses to various questions people ask, there's also the need to be able to relate to specific audiences, to be able to learn the languages that they use, to be able to know how to communicate with them, to know, in fact, what's going to work and what's not going to work. And so that's why I want to say that it's very important that we don't neglect the art side of apologetics, because in many ways that's where you are going to be doing your best work. It means you need to understand the audience you're speaking to. It means you need to figure out how best I can express this idea to this audience, and what stories I might tell, what authorities I might cite in order to connect up with this specific audience. So I think this is a helpful way of thinking about apologetics. Also, I do need to say that we need to make sure we have a theological framework for apologetics, because there are many people who think of apologetics primarily as a series of techniques. If someone asks you this question, you say this. If someone asks you that question, you say this, And really, I think we have to try and get away from this and say that actually it's not simply about learning responses. It's about, in effect, being open to the promptings of God. Apologetics is a very theological discipline in which, in effect, we are allowing God to use us to serve Him as best we can. So I think it's helpful just to get that in context. So let's now begin to think again about narratives. And I guess one of the key questions we're asking here is, what stories will you tell? In other words, if you are thinking in terms of doing some apologetic addresses, how will you choose these stories? Will you use biblical stories? Will you tell your own story or the stories of other people? What I want to say is you've got lots of choice here. And in many ways, you've got to just think through what might seem to work best for you. And my point is, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to choose some very good things. So that, I think, is a very important point, that there's a lot of resources there. But I also want to emphasize a point that I hinted at earlier, and that is that you really do need to see yourself as an interface between the Christian faith and your audience. If you like, you're the person who's interpreting the faith to this audience. You're the person who knows the kind of questions they're going to be asking and can work out how to, in effect, begin to answer them in terms that will really relate to you. Now, those of you who are already preachers will know all about this, the whole business of trying to communicate effectively, to be able to speak their language. But it is really a very important skill apologetically. And that's one of the reasons why I think apologetics is probably best done at a local level, where you know your audience very well indeed. So I mentioned that book there earlier, and the point I was trying to make through it was simply, stories are really, really good. They are not anti-argumentative. In fact, in many ways, a story very often is here is how I discovered these arguments and how they changed my mind. So they are, not giving up on rationality, but I think this book does make it very clear how important these issues are. So let's now begin to think about how we might use biblical narratives in apologetics. I think the important point to make here is that Scripture is rich in narratives. And the question is going to be, how can you take these and use these apologetically? What I'm going to do is give you some suggestions, but again, what I'm trying to do is not say, hey, here's an easy fix. It's much more, this may be helpful to you as you think this through for yourself and develop your own distinct approaches to these. One of them is the exile from Jerusalem in Babylon, which of course was a very pivotal moment in the history of Israel. So what I want to do is think, how might we use this apologetically? So I'm going to tell you what I think, but this is just to get your own thinking going, because in many ways, it's a skill I want you to develop. What is the narrative of the exile all about? It's about the people of Jerusalem, or at least most of the people of Jerusalem, over a period of time, being deported from their native city, Jerusalem, to Babylon. They weren't held in slavery, they were treated actually quite well. But the point is, they were far, far away from home, and they longed to go back. They had to sing the songs of Zion in Babylon, but really their hearts were back in Jerusalem. So what I want you to do is just get used to that framework, and then we're going to use it apologetically. The framework is this: people deported from their native country to a strange place. It's not where they belong, it's where they are. Those are not the same things. And they remember their homeland. They think of what Jerusalem used to be like and lament not being there, while keeping alive the hope of going back. So that's the framework. Now, how might you use that apologetically? Here's one way you might use it. You might say, well, actually, Christianity tells us that we're in exile here on earth. This isn't where we really belong. We're here for a season. We really belong somewhere else, New Jerusalem. But we're here on earth for the moment. And we keep alive this hope of going back to where we really belong, where we really come from, where we're really meant to be. And that's a very important theme. What you're saying to people is, this is a kind of framework that Christians use to make sense of their situation. We don't really belong here on earth. We're passing through. We belong somewhere else, and one day we're going home again. And while we are here on earth, we keep alive the language of our true homeland, its customs, and the hope of returning there. And of course, its moral laws as well. So what you can begin to do is say, look, if you're trying to understand what Christianity is all about, this is actually quite a good starting point, quite a good framework to use in thinking about these, because it gives you a way of thinking about what Christianity is. You're taking a narrative of the exile and you're interpreting it theologically and saying this helps us understand what Christianity is all about. So that's one very good example. But let me give you several other examples. And what I'm just going to do is work through some more. And as I talk these through with you, I'm really inviting you to think, how would you use these? And what others might you use as well? Now, when we were talking about narratives, of course, we did mention the parables, which are very, very important. Some of these are very, very brief. Some of them are quite long and extended. And the parable of the pearl of great price is a very short parable indeed. It's about a merchant who sees this pearl and suddenly everything seems inadequate, insignificant in its life. Having seen this, nothing else really stands up. Nothing really seems adequate. This pearl suddenly brings out how inadequate everything else is. And the merchant realizes he has to have this pearl. It's so special. And I'm sure you could provide lots of other examples of this. But you see, the point I want to make is this. This can be used very effectively to explore an apologetic theme. In effect, look, we think we found something that really satisfies us, and then we find it doesn't. We realize that actually something that we thought would satisfy us may prove adequate for a short time, and then we become restless all over again, looking for something that is really going to satisfy. And you'll be familiar with this line of argument from Pascal, or indeed from C.S. Lewis in the chapter on hope in Mere Christianity, where he makes the point that that we experience this sense of longing for something, and nothing on this earth is really able to satisfy us. And for Lewis, that proves that really we were created for another world. But the point I want to make is this. Apologetically, you can quite easily tell that story of the Pearl of Great Price. It's very short, it's very easy to tell. And then you try and make this point. You say, look, I think we're all looking for something really special, and sometimes we think we found it. And then something happens and we realize that what we had once thought would satisfy us, in fact, does not. And we really have not yet found something of ultimate significance which gives us that deep sense of satisfaction and meaning, which is what we're looking for. And it's a parable which allows you to begin to explain why Christianity is more than just a set of beliefs. It's all about something beautiful. It's all about something satisfying. It's all about things that are meaningful. And as you explore those themes of meaning, of value, of satisfaction, you can tell stories. You can tell your own story. You can tell the story of somebody else. For example, Augustine's quest for beauty, or C.S. Lewis's discovery of Christianity. Stories that might well help bring this to light and help somebody realize that their sense of emptiness, their sense of spiritual dissatisfaction, may be because they're looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place. But there is something that really is going to satisfy. And that, of course, is when you can tell your story and begin to make connections between your own existence and this feeling of longing or whatever else it is. And I do want to make the point that you must feel free to use your own experience as a story. Because in effect, whether you're talking about your own discovery of faith or the difference that faith makes to you in a day-by-day context, you are sending out a very powerful signal. This is real, not just true, real. This is transformative. It really matters. It shapes me. And of course, the implication is it will shape you as well. Now, some of you will say, well, that's very true, but I don't think I've got a very interesting story to tell. But of course, if you are giving an apologetic talk, there's nothing to stop you inviting a colleague to come up and tell their story of how they discovered Christianity, or how they discovered that in effect Christianity brought peace and joy and satisfaction. So these are all important things to think about. So that's the parable of the pearl of great price. A second parable I thought I'd look at is the parable of the prodigal son. This is actually quite a long parable, and it seems to make multiple points. But it's a very powerful parable when dealing with cultural change, cultural problems of one sort or another. Because again, what you probably do is tell the story. And what is interesting is that as part of the cultural process of erosion of faith, which I'm afraid we see around us, There are an awful lot of people who have never heard this parable and don't know how it ends. So you can recreate that sense of surprise the original audience would have at the Father's response to the Son. But here's what I think is very helpful apologetically with this story. And again, let me emphasize there's a lot more to this story than the point I'm going to make. But it's about, in effect, the Son feeling, I want to go to a distant land because things will be better there. I can get away from my Father and I can go there and I will be happy. And the point I want to make to you is that every generation has its own far country or distant land. And you may need to spell out what that might be. You may need to give some examples. But the point is, initially, this seemed to be wonderful. And then, as time passed, it became humdrum, routine, alienating, unsatisfying. And the Son says, I'm going home again, because that's where I really belong. And there are lots of apologetic themes you can weave in here. Let me mention just a few very obvious ones. Number one, not feeling you really belong somewhere. Is there somewhere I am meant to be? Do you remember when I talked about Paul's soteriological image of adoption? One of the key themes that emerges from Paul's use of that idea is you belong. You are wanted. You matter. And you know, that's a very important point to be able to make. And indeed, you could say that the church can model that kind of community by welcoming and wanting and accepting people. But the point is that this parable of the prodigal son is very much about someone who feels he doesn't belong anywhere anymore, that what used to satisfy him does so no more. That's a very important point, because there are many people in our culture who have this sense of disillusionment. Think of those people who were initially drawn to Richard Dawkins, and as they explored it, thought, this isn't right, there's something wrong here. But this is a wider phenomenon. People feeling that there's something wrong, they don't really belong here, and wondering if there's somewhere that they really belong. Maybe that parable gives us a framework to talk about these themes. Where do you really belong? Is there a home for you to go to? And these are very powerful themes, which I think are very deep in the human spirit. And certainly we're able to begin to talk about these. And of course, the key point is the response of the Father to the returning Son. That of delight and joy. In other words, being prepared to accept back and start all over again. Now, there's so much in those parables which I know you'll be able to take and use. What I want to suggest is that we think about how we might be able to use these narratives in talking about people. Another biblical narrative that we need to think about more is the crucifixion, because it is a very powerful narrative of Christ accepting what is laid upon him. And I think it always seems to me that it allows us to do a lot of very helpful apologetic things. For example, here's one of them. Supposing we want to talk about the love of God. How would you actually talk about that? Because we might say, well, the love of God is so wonderful, we can't actually put it into words. No words are good enough to express it, which may be true, but it means you haven't really said very much to people who are wondering what the love of God might be like. But as you will all know, the New Testament at multiple points says, in effect, the love of God is demonstrated in that Christ died for sinners. In other words, the more you tell that narrative, the more detail you give, the enormous costliness becomes very, very clear. And the idea of God loving us becomes extremely clear and vivid. So I think there are various things we can do here to try and bring this out. So there are biblical narratives we can use, but also cultural narratives. Now, as we were reflecting on people like Tolkien and Lewis, and many others as well, one of the points I was trying to bring out is that these stories are already there, and you might think about how you would use narratives from Lewis or Tolkien in your apologetic ministry. So I'm going to give you an example which is taken from Lewis's novel, The Silver Chair. The Silver Chair is the sixth, a late entry in the Chronicles of Narnia. And the apologetic question that is being engaged with is this. We make God up, and we model God on what we see around us. So in effect, we invent God because we need God, and because there isn't really a God, we just model God on things that lie to hand in our environment, such as other people or our parents. Now, if I was doing an apologetic address on that, I would probably use very predictable, rational arguments. I would say something like this. Number one, it may be true that we end up desiring certain things and needing certain things, but that does not make them untrue. I try to make that point. I would also make the point that actually a very good case can be made that atheism is a case of wish fulfillment. I want to be able to do whatever I like, and therefore I will in effect reject God because that removes any inhibition to doing things I want. And these are all perfectly reasonable arguments, but they're not very interesting. Lewis tells a story, and the story he tells is about the Narnian prince going into the underworld, this underworld cavern, and trying to persuade the witch who lives there that there is a world beyond the cave. And you'll all know this scene, you've probably read it many times. It draws very heavily on Plato's allegory of the cave in his dialogue, The Republic. But basically, the objection that the Narnian has to deal with is this. The witch listens to him speak about this overworld, and she's very polite, and then says, well, look, it seems to me that what you are talking about is simply an invention based on this world. I mean, you talk about the sun in the sky. Well, look, it's based on that lamp there. And that's all there is to it. The lamp is real, and you've just copied the sun from that. It's an invention. That's all there is to it. And yet, of course, what Lewis is doing is showing us that what seems to be a very sophisticated argument actually doesn't work at all, because we all know there is a sun there. And so what Lewis has done, in effect, is to show us a context in which the argument is shown not to be satisfactory at all. So there are lots of examples we can use, and I think the real issue is how we're going to be able to find those and use them. I've already mentioned the importance of your personal narratives, and again I want to just ask you to reflect on what in your own personal history might be apologetically interesting or significant. In other words, what stories might you tell that might be really helpful in an apologetic address? But what I want to do now is begin to stand back a little bit and think more about Lewis, narratives, and apologetics. Let's go back to Lewis. Why do people like him so much? In England, it's very well established. Lewis is well liked right across denominational boundaries and even kind of theological boundaries within denominations. And nobody really quite understands why this is, but it means that Lewis really attracts a lot of people. He's the kind of person you can reference in public without embarrassment. So he is a useful figure to be able to quote. What sort of things would you be able to use? I've talked about Lewis's writings, about the way in which he developed narrative techniques to engage specific apologetic questions, but I think there are points at which Lewis himself uses narratives to make important points. So I'm going to tell you about one of his sermons in which he tells a story. And the background to the story is very simply this. Lewis learnt how to dive in 1931 and found it very, very exciting. And then he wrote this into a Christmas Day sermon of, I think it was 1943. And Lewis says that he would like us to imagine someone getting ready to dive into a deep pool. And the diver strips off all his clothes, dives in, and his lungs are bursting, goes down and down and down, and then he comes up to the surface, his lungs bursting, holding up in his hand a little object which was at the bottom of the lake, which he had wanted to retrieve. And Lewis gives a beautiful description of the danger of the dive and the sense of astonishment at the diver reappearing, holding this object. And then Lewis says, that's what Christ did. He entered into this world with all of its danger and risk in order to bring us up from the depths into his presence. And the point is, it's a very powerful sermon, which in effect I think brings home to us how a narrative can give imaginative depth to what is otherwise simply a theological explanation. And that does seem to me to be a very good example of Lewis telling a story to make a very powerful and very important apologetic point. So that is Lewis on diving. But Lewis himself, as I was saying, is, I think, a very interesting writer to use apologetically. And I mentioned earlier that Lewis is extremely good at translating. And what I want to, in effect, ask you to do is to think of whether we can learn something from Lewis on this point. Because we know that Lewis worked very, very hard on his style to try and increase his accessibility, to try and make himself more powerful as a speaker, as someone who in effect was trying to communicate to his audiences. And in many ways what Lewis is doing is trying to develop analogies, stories that really will capture people's imaginations and then use them for apologetic purposes. And I guess the question we need to think about is, what are those stories that we might use? I've covered a number of them in these lectures. So let's then reflect a bit more on Lewis and think about what he says to us today. I've talked about Lewis's narratives, but I haven't talked very much about Lewis's life and how that actually is very helpful to us as apologists. So here's the first point I'm going to make. Many of you will know that in his later years, Lewis regularly doubted his own ability as an apologist. He said, you know, I'm just no good. The people who really mattered to me, Mrs. Moore and Arthur Greaves, I never got to convert them. You know, they were resistant to me. I couldn't do it there. And Lewis also became more and more increased again as he got older, that he simply wasn't up to the task of apologetics. He said this, and I wonder if this makes some kind of sense to you. He says, I never feel more unconvinced of a doctrine than when I am defending it in public. What he meant by that is that the act of defending it made him quite vulnerable, and he felt he had not done justice to the topic. I'm sure we can all give examples of that. I think we can learn from that, because I think the danger is that we present Lewis as a sort of almost idol, someone who was so good, all we've got to do is imitate Lewis. And very often we just neglect to look at the darker side of Lewis, being aware of his own weakness, his own vulnerability, and yet at the same time, I think, knowing that Lewis does say some very important and helpful things. And I think that's important, because my guess is that many of you here today at some point have felt something very similar. I didn't perform very well then. That wasn't very well done. I didn't do justice to that. And if you do feel like that, then Lewis's response was to say, right, next time I do that, I'll do it better. And he would, in effect, go back to that question and do it again. And again, when we're dealing with questions in apologetics, very often that's when many people find this quite difficult, because it's very, very difficult to anticipate questions, and it's very, very difficult to know quite what you might say. And maybe what you need to do is think about how you might predict some possible questions and prepare answers in advance. Partly just to help you gain courage, gain strength, but also because you can then expand those and talk to people. And one of the things I found very helpful apologetically is to get a little group of people, say 5 or 6, and you're each given an apologetic topic, and you talk about that, and you kind of give each other what I'm sure will be very helpful feedback as you try and help each other to grow and develop in this field. So Lewis, I think, does illustrate some very important points. Do you remember I showed you that picture of Lewis from 1917 in an earlier lecture? Lewis standing there in May 1917, about to go off to the front in France to fight for the British Army. And I often wonder what would have been going through Lewis's mind at that time. And I can tell you it wasn't going to be, I'm going to be a great Christian apologist, because he wasn't even a Christian at the time. But I think that really brings me back to reinforcing this point about a theological framework for apologetics. Because, as I was saying earlier, there's this constant danger that we'll think of apologetics as techniques that you and I can master. And I want to suggest to you that in many ways, apologetics is about allowing God to take each of us and use us despite our obvious weaknesses and limitations. And that seems to me to be very important. When I began these lectures, I put up on the screen 1 Peter 3:15, which is a wonderful apologetic text. But you know, there's another text which I think is even more important for apologists, and it's from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. These words, remember Paul was having this concern about a thorn in the flesh, which he felt meant he was not acting well at all. And Paul heard the Lord say these words to him: my power is made perfect in weakness, my grace is sufficient for you. And I think that those verses really speak to us as apologists, because they in effect say that we are charged with something of immense significance which lies beyond our power to defend properly. But we're not doing this on our own, and God will be able to help us as we begin to think about these things. Now, I'm going to stop here because we covered a lot of ground, and I'm going to suggest that we feel free to move into time of Q&A. We can go right back to the first thing I talked about this morning and just deal with anything that's arisen from this morning's presentation. So I'm very happy now to take questions on anything we've talked about at all today, because we can revisit all the things and take them up. So who would like to begin? We have lots of questions coming.
I have a question with regard to broken frameworks, because while it can be easier to talk to atheists, when it comes to nuns who have the symbolism, who have the language, but whose frameworks have been broken, I find it very, very difficult communicating on a more than individual basis.
Yes, I think that is a very shrewd observation, and I think I'd have to agree with that, because I've talked to people like this, and there don't seem to be any general answers. You know, it's much more, I'm talking to this person, and this person has their own history, their own story, and it's an individual story, and that means I can't use a generalized answer. I've got to listen to what they're saying, but I can perhaps pick up on some of the themes that are likely to be there. One of them is the theme of disconnection. That's there with a lot of these people. I used to think this, and that thing is still there, but it doesn't mean anything anymore. And trying to talk about how you can reconnect is actually quite difficult to do, but also enormously important. And this is where narratives come into their own. Because you see, the person you're talking to will tell you their narrative of disconnection. And I know from talking to many of these people that actually a lot of them do reconnect. And so when they tell me about this, I ask them, do you mind if without mentioning anything about you, I tell that story? You see, and actually, that's one of the best apologetic rules you can have is the best person to talk about a particular issue is someone who's been through that and come out the other side. Because it has a sort of intellectual and emotional integrity and intelligence, which someone like me who probably just thinks about these things won't have. So I think, you know, what we really need to do is find people who've been in these places and have honestly experienced this and would then be able to say, I think I can say something helpful to people who are now there and allow the rest of us to use their stories. So I think you're right. You know, there's a danger that, if I can put it like this, we adopt a template approach to apologetics. You know, this answer will work very well for this, even though it doesn't fit exactly. And actually, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, Richard Dawkins and I have debated on occasions, and I have to say that on those occasions, I've often felt it was like talking to a tape recorder, because, you know, he in effect, his pre-prepared answers just didn't engage the questions I was asking. I think there's a danger that we will do the same as apologists by not being seen to really listen to this person and engage with the question they're asking. And that's why very often you find people develop specialist areas of apologetics, because it takes quite a lot of time to listen to people in these particular situations. But if that's you, then two things. One, it'll be really good for you and your ministry, and two, please tell other people about it. Above all, what you find helpful and why. Because this is all about shared wisdom and experience. And these kind of situations are really important. I think we need to share wisdom on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the interesting lectures. So I do like your approach to biblical narratives, and for example, this sense of belonging and belonging in a different sphere, so to speak. But I wonder if Christianity may come across as a bit gloomy or condescending when it only wants to give answers to people's discomforts in life, people's fear of not belonging. I wonder if we might gain something by pointing to the beauty already present in people's lives, giving them an address for their gratitude and satisfaction, so to speak.
Well, I think this is a very fair point. I mean, one of the things I find is that while this is a little bit arbitrary, it is helpful to think of things in terms of vulnerabilities, where you know the thinking things through and realize that where they are at present isn't a very good place to be. So you can begin to explore those further with them, help them see there really are problems, but there's something that can be done about this. But you're right, I mean, that is only part of this. And we also need a framework which is able to say there are certain things you are celebrating, and actually you will celebrate them even more, if I can put it like that, by seeing them in this way. And I think that's right. Also, this is a problem about being condescending. I mean, you're right. Very often you know, and again, we'll all do this from time to time because none of us are perfect, but very often I have this sense, oh dear, I come across as someone who's saying, well, you think it's like this, but actually really it's like this, and I know and you don't, sort of thing. And that isn't helpful. And so I think what we have to do almost is to say, as an apologist, I have to cultivate a certain persona. I've just got to say, I need to listen carefully. I need not to be arrogant. Even if I think I know an answer to that question, I need to hold off and make sure I've heard them properly and then begin to be able to do it. When I was teaching students at Oxford on this, I said, look, really the first thing an apologist has to do is listen. You talk back when you've listened and you've earned the right to talk back, and also you made sure you've understood them and can kind of then say something meaningful back. So I think that one of the reasons why some people are quite negative about apologetics is this feeling that really it is a bit lightweight and superficial and formulaic. And that can be a problem, but it doesn't have to be. And you know, apologetics, I think, really happens in two main formats. One is in a sort of lecture theatre format. The other is one-to-one conversations that nobody else ever gets to hear about. But actually, I sometimes find those the most important because they're, you know, you can sustain a meaningful conversation. Very often, they will say, as Dionysius said to Paul, we will hear more if you want this, you know, but you're learning. And actually, we learn, I'm afraid, by making mistakes. And we just have to say, right, I made a mistake here, but I can learn from it. I'm going to move on. Because, you know, apologetics is very much about listening and trying to bring people into contact with something that's going to be life-changing. And that is actually quite a big responsibility. So I think I can see why C.S. Lewis found it at times a little bit oppressive, because he felt he had to do this. He was the right person to do it. I don't think he really wanted to, but he felt he just had to and kept going. And your question, by the way, also brings out a practical point, which is very, very important. Apologists need to support each other. You need kind of networks, because it is quite lonely, and it's always good to be able to share experiences and reflections with other people.
Thank you. I was wondering, it seems to have quite a big place in your approach here in terms of epistemology knowledge, the role of emotions and experiences. I was wondering if you could comment on that. Which kind of role do you think emotions, experiences, and intuitions have in acquiring true beliefs? And yeah.
Well, this is a very good question, and it might need quite a long answer, but I'm going to try and sketch one, because it is a really good question. I think one of the difficulties is that as human beings, we have this habit of reifying certain things. We reify reason. There's this thing called reason. There's this thing called imagination. It's really there. These things called emotion are really there. What you have actually is a complex human being, and these things are all interconnected. And it's actually very, very difficult to disentangle them. So when someone says, you know, you're being a reasonable person, really they're being quite unhelpful, because what they're doing is trying to isolate one particular aspect of the way in which we as human beings make sense of our world and ourselves. And intuition really is very important. If we take Albert Einstein as a secular example, okay, Einstein was absolutely clear. Intuition really is instrumental to scientific discovery. We just have this gut feeling, this deep down sense, it's something like this. And so you go and look for it, and sometimes it turns out to be right. But I think in terms of apologetics, intuition is very often this sense, I cannot quite put it into words, but there is something there, something really significant, and I need to find it. And actually that is there are a lot of people, and the apologist's role is to try and unpack this and see how you can help them to find the door in the wall, to use Lewis's very famous image, through which they can go and actually find out what all this is about. And people express this in all kinds of ways. They say, I don't know how to express this, but I just had this feeling that there was something very, very big out there, and I think I saw it, and then I didn't, but I just know there is something there. And a lot of people will talk about what we would now call experiences of transcendence, this feeling that there is someone or something there, but what do we make of this? And so it is actually quite important to be able to say that actually is a clue to something much bigger. And Lewis does use this imagery of clues quite a lot. A clue is something which maybe on its own isn't really very significant. When you get a number of them, they begin to connect up with each other, form a pattern. You begin to realize there is something there, which is why mere Christianity is about clues to the meaning of the universe. It's a very good line, I think. So I think we have to be aware that intuitions actually do play a very important role apologetically. The difficulty is finding out what people's intuitions are, but sometimes they will tell you. And they won't use the language of intuition. Very often they will say a sort of deep down feeling or sort of insight, something like that. But this is what they're getting at. And I think that we can begin to use this to help move things on. I need to say more than that, but that's a very good question. Thank you for that.
I have a question as well. Thank you for the answer. I was wondering, when we use this image or way of thinking about Christianity as a story, which is very powerful and significant, are there any blind spots that we are missing or letting out? One thing I'm thinking of in particular is when Karen Van Hoosen speaks of Christianity as a drama. It's a different picture, and it can have some different dimensions and applications. What are we maybe missing out on if we are speaking of Christianity as a story?
Well, I think that there are a number of things we are missing out on. First of all, in English, the word story is a bit flat. It doesn't really have depth, whereas the word drama does have the idea of a story that actually is exciting, or that is, has these emotional ups and downs. And that's something there. And Dorothy L. Sayers, who talks a lot about the drama of doctrine, makes a very, very similar point. So I think the difficulty is that in English, anyway, the word story is the word we would use, because it kind of identifies itself and established itself as the right word in this context. But we have to try and unpack this to make sense of things. But let me say the emotional flatness of it is one problem. Two, the association with fiction is another. A story is very often something we invent. Now, what you can say, I think, and this is a very important point to make, is that very often cultural anthropologists will tell us that people tell stories to safeguard vital memories that are essential for communal well-being. In other words, it's preserving a truth, a sense of who we are or where we've come from, and we don't want to lose that, so we pass it down as a story that is told around the campfire or told to our children, and we keep it going. So in effect, very often when you think about narratives of identity, it's saying this is who we are as a people. This is where we came from, this is who we are, and this story is essential to our future and identity. And of course, in terms of the people of Israel, you might think of the narrative of the crossing of the Red Sea, the Passover institution, and so on. All these things are really important. So it doesn't have to be fictional, but we need to be aware, not so much that we might think that, but the people we're talking to will say, you're telling us a story, i.e. you're telling us something that is not true and asking us to believe in it. So I think we just have to say that that we're using the word story, and you have to emphasize that what I'm talking about when I say a story is something that is in effect being told about the past and about the present, which actually helps us to make sense of things, and it's rooted in something that is real and significant. And it has the ability to help us understand who we are right now. So I think that that's one thing, the associations of the term story with fiction. The other point that you were making is that very often the word story doesn't really register the depth of it. That, there are stories that are told that are exciting, that really evoke a deep response from us. And the word story itself doesn't convey that. So again, you're going to have to try and use language that is laden, like drama, to try and bring this point out, that actually this is a story that really grabs your attention and gives you a sense of vastness, which is what drama does. And that's very important. Having said that, I think these are two weaknesses we can live with, because actually stories work really quite well. The important thing is just to kind of identify the misunderstandings that might be there, and then be able to kind of move people away from those. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alister, for some really good lectures. You talked about the importance of personal narratives, and also quickly said in the beginning, when a story is the only thing that people can remember after you spoke. So my question is, how do we avoid using our personal stories / narratives to distract us from the argument or point we're trying to make? You know, when you're having a sermon or something, and you're using a personal story or a personal narrative or a biblical story even, but you draw a wrong point out of it, or it makes it a distraction for the congregation.
I think that is a very difficult question to answer, and it's nothing to do with the problem of the issue of a story, or indeed the capacity of a preacher to preach a good sermon. It's to do with human memory. That actually very often what happens is we focus in on what we find really interesting, and that kind of way blots out other bits of it. So very often everything that should have been there was there in the sermon. What stands out is the image. And what you've got to try and do is enable the meaning to be reattached to the image. My wife and I were talking about a sermon I preached in 1981, in which she can still remember the image I used. What's interesting is she can also remember what I did with it. Now, I'll tell you what this was, and you can judge it. I'll explain that when I was growing up, we had only one kind of potato chips, and these were simply plain, and you had to have a bag of salt in the bag of crisps, because otherwise they'd be inedible. And I made the point that actually very often you find there was no bag of salt at all. So what happened was, when you got two in a bag of crisps, you kept the blue bag of salt for the next time. And I talked about this, how salt really was essential for bringing out flavor and lots of other things, and then made the connection, you are the salt of the earth, and began to develop the idea that Christians bring savor and depth to life. Most people only remember the salt bag. You see, and it's just the real problem. What you can do is, if you are preaching on a sustained basis, is to kind of keep going back to these things. But really, I'm afraid, with any kind of talk which is not being recorded, then you are at the mercy of individual human memories, which are very focused on what they find memorable. So in effect, the memorable image, they'll hold on to that. Oh, he preached a wonderful sermon, it's all about a dog. And then there was a dog in it, yes, but you used the dog to illustrate something else, and they've forgotten what that was. But at the time, they will probably have remembered it. It fades with time. Can't do anything about it, I'm afraid. But what I suggest you do is just say, well, that actually brings home to us how a story can be a way of anchoring something. You know, in effect saying, this story, this very important idea, they kind of way go together. So I think in this day when so many things are now recorded, you can happily replay it. So do you do this? Very often when I'm watching a TV drama, I don't quite get what's happening, so I'll rewind and play it again to try and do it. And if only life was like that. But I mean, with recordings of lectures, you can then rewind and make sure you got the full thing. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was thinking about the psychologist Jordan Peterson.
Oh, yes.
Some series on Genesis, where he looks at the narrative stories of Genesis and strips it of all the theological things, and looks at it at a psychological level. Do you think this is a helpful tool for apologists, or do you think it's making the biblical stories not as important?
I think what Jordan Peterson is doing is to use a kind of a way of understanding myths to read Genesis and then to really say that's what this is really about, and that's what matters. when in fact it's much more complicated than that. So I personally am very glad he's engaging Genesis, because I hope it will lead other people to engage the same texts and maybe come up with a different answer. I think my broader reflections on Jordan Peterson are these. I mean, my feeling is that Jordan Peterson is becoming a cult figure, particularly for alienated young white men. And what I wonder is, what's happened to the role models? You know, who do young white men look to from a role model for inspiration? Because it's clearly a very significant issue. But Jordan Peterson wrote a book quite early in his career called Maps of Meaning. And it's a really interesting book because, in effect, what you're saying is, as human beings, we really need meaning, and we try and map out things in a way that helps us to work out where to find meaning and how to make use of it. So you can see he's really put his finger on, there's something about us. The British novelist Jeanette Winterson says human beings are meaning-seeking animals. You know, we need this, and it's really integral to who we are. And yet modern Western culture doesn't really help us deal with this. But it's integral to religion, it's integral to Christianity. The difficulty is that we don't very often talk about this. And so people very often don't realize that this aspect of Christianity, which connects so well with modern Western cultural needs, is kind of way not given the attention which I think it deserves. Thank you.
I think that one of the difficult biblical stories to preach on, and there are quite a lot, are the stories of Jesus healing people. Not many people in my congregation have that story of being physically healed. So how can that, both as an apologetic approach and just as a great story that God can heal, how can we keep that story alive when very few people see it happen today?
Well, again, it's a very good point, and I find this really quite difficult to deal with. Partly because in telling the gospel story of how someone is healed, I'm looking at the people I'm talking to, and a lot of them are not healed, or not to my knowledge healed. And I feel, am I implying something wrong with them? They have not been healed, you know, and that's my concern. Also, people very often feel that in today's culture, the narratives of healing kind of create certain expectations about the nature of disability, which actually might not really fit in with where we are as a culture at the moment. So there are a lot of problems here. So I don't really have a very good answer to this. And this is very often the case. You just feel that you're not really able to give a compelling answer. But nevertheless, you can say that what very often is happening is that people have been given a vision of hope, even though that hope doesn't actually necessarily work out like that, but it can work out in other ways. So I find this quite difficult because I think many people who I preach to expect to be healed in an instant, but they would like to keep that hope alive. And I'm never quite sure just how to get this balance right between not wanting to raise their expectations too much and at the same time wanting to really say something very significant has happened here. And that's what we're celebrating this morning. But it is difficult. And if you have wisdom, tell me. Thank you.
I was wondering, about imagination and how it in some ways points towards God in a way. Then I was just wondering how it's possible in any way for Wells, for example, to write with imagination about something that doesn't point to God, as you say, or a naturalistic way. Make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes.
It's everything that is created in a way, created good and with some intention of God.
Thank you. Well, we were talking earlier about the problems of rendering this word imagination, because it means different things to different people. I think part of the problem here is that Wells is using his imagination to create a plot line, to create a scenario, to in effect really develop a very engaging scenario about, for example, the War of the Worlds. thinking of this idea that actually the Martians are coming after us because they've messed up their own planet and now they're coming here. And again, we would now read the War of the Worlds thinking, my goodness, we're messing up this planet, so what's going to happen here? But certainly Wells is using his imagination there to create a scenario, to create a narrative. He's just drawing boundary lines and saying, I don't go further than this, I don't go into this God area. But C.S. Lewis would see the imagination as God's gift to us, to keep this knowledge of this wider, bigger vision of reality alive, because it's something that is so important to us, and the imagination helps us to sustain that. So they're both using the imagination, but in slightly different ways, I think.
A slightly another question. It's more like experience in Narnia, actually. I'm just wondering if you have heard of people with this psychedelic, maybe like magic mushrooms and such, expanding consciousness and almost like experiencing imagination, Narnia and such, because I've just heard quite a few testimonies in the last few years about people actually using psychedelic substances from nature and experiencing the Creator and meeting Christ through those experiences, because they're actually facing their demons and they have such a strong faith also in the Creator and in Christ afterwards. So a little bit off topic, but also in Narnia in real world, if you had any, not personal experiences, but
No personal experiences. It's a good one because, as you will know, before certain things became illegal, there were a lot of experiments done on inducing hallucinations and trying to understand how this helped us understand how the imagination worked. And you're quite right, I mean, a lot of these people did have sometimes quite spiritual, not always though, hallucinations. Sometimes they were rather frightening or rather, in fact, really alienating. But some of them were very much a sort of sense of complete blissfulness, something like that. So I guess you could say that there was something going on here. But the difficulty is knowing what to make of it, whether there's a distorting element introduced by the mescaline or whatever it is you're using. So I don't know, but certainly there's been a lot of work done on what sort of chemical or physical stimuli do help people concentrate on God, and very often that involves being able to imagine God. And actually, it's quite interesting. I mean, I won't give you a lecture on it, don't worry. But the posture you adopt in prayer, actually, that affects blood supply, and actually, it does really play into this. So there is something quite significant there. But on the particular topic you've raised, I don't know, I'm afraid. But you're right. The experiments have been done, and they show that something is going on there.
Thank you for interesting lectures. The way I've been taught about postmodernity is that the great narratives, they are dead. So we have these meta-narratives instead, but they are constructed by the lowest denominator, like be good to one another and live a happy life. So I think the problem, the challenge of these stories, these embodied stories, is that people construct their meaning by a framework of narratives. So how do we make our narratives not become a part of somebody else's framework, but instead challenge their meta-narrative and become a great story, so to say, in their life? Because I think that we want to connect people to the great story of Christianity, the great narrative. Does my question make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. I like this question. Let me just explore with you. I mean, postmodernity was suspicious of meta-narratives. It realized that they were there, but it felt that very often a meta-narrative was something that enslaved you or, in effect, limited you in some way. I can see why they're worried about that, but actually their critique does not in any way dismiss the fact that meta-narratives are there and people find them very, very attractive. Here's what I would suggest in response to your question. I would say, look, I have my own narrative, here's how I tell it. Now that narrative could possibly be interpreted from the perspective of that meta-narrative or another meta-narrative. But this doesn't have anything to do with the validity of my narrative. It's simply making a judgment about which bigger meta-narrative is the more reliable. So for example, I mean, if I would tell the story of how I came to faith in God, if your meta-narrative is faith in God is delusional caused by social situations, then you could easily fit my narrative into that meta-narrative. You'd say, oh, Alister, he's just yet another example of someone who believed in God because he was socially alienated, something like that. So I think that you can say that is a demeaning and limiting meta-narrative, which is simply designed with the purpose of refusing to take my personal narrative seriously. So you could begin to be critical about that and say that I don't think that you are entitled to use this meta-narrative to treat my own story in this way. And again, it just shows us, I think, how people may criticize meta-narratives, but very often they use them all the time. A very good question is whether a meta-narrative is liberating or enslaving. And very often you'll find meta-narratives that are simply saying, we can explain all of this and it's all to do with that, and therefore you have to accept this is right and live with that. Whereas a more liberating meta-narrative would take the specificity of our own individual stories much more seriously. And for me, that's why Christianity is so important. It does give you a way of, in effect, saying my narrative fits this, but actually my individual identity is preserved, so I can be the person who God wants me to be, rather than simply a kind of cog in a machine. Thank you.
Perfect way, but you talked about the quote of Augustine, that our hearts are restless until we find rest in God. And I was, this summer I visited Norway. I was on a lot of hikes, seeing amazingly beautiful mountain ranges, rivers, etc. And I had the impression that I am only enjoying this maybe 2% of what I ought to be. And quite often this has been my experience. When I experience something very, very beautiful, I get the impression that I don't belong to it, and I can't really grasp it the way I probably ought to. So I was thinking, when we meet the beauty or see the beauty in narratives, or in the biblical narratives, how does sin and the human nature affect our way of grasping it, and can we somehow turn that into a kind of hope for the new world, or how do we use this experience of not grasping beauty as we ought to point people to Christ? Does it make sense?
It does make sense, and I think I can say something helpful. I think that most theologians or philosophers of religion would say something like this, that we are inhibited from fully appreciating the beauty or the glory of something, partly by the fact that we are limited human beings. In other words, there's a finite capacity for processing we possess. And secondly, because there's something distorting about the way in which we read the world. And people very often will talk about the noetic impact of sin, meaning in some way sin is causing us to misread or misappreciate something. So these two things here are, I think, two very important elements of understanding why we don't see these things with the full beauty and grandeur that they ought to. What most Christian theologians would say is that this gives us an added reason to look forward to being liberated from the burden of being human. That actually we are no longer limited either by sin or by finitude. And actually that means that one day we'll see things as they really are. And you know that's what some people think Paul may be getting at. Now we see through a glass darkly, but then there's very great excitement. We shall see face to face, we'll be known as we are, that sort of thing. It's really exciting. So I guess what you could say is, if you feel you're enjoying something 5% of what you should, then think ahead to the joy of seeing it fully and properly. But my own view is, I'm sure that's the case with me, that actually I don't see things as they properly are, but I still see enough of them to make me think, isn't that wonderful? So it's not a complete answer to your question, but it's a sort of pragmatic response.
Thank you very much, Alister, for your thoughts. My name is Jonathan. I'm a Christian fiction. I have the feeling that most Christian fiction today is very preachy and not very good at all, both in film and literature. And maybe you have some thoughts on why is it so? Because I think that we have a better story to tell and we have a ground for imagination. But I don't feel like there's been some very good fictionists since Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And maybe you have some recommendations of modern Christian writers or filmmakers.
Well, thank you. I think, I know what you mean. I mean, there is a genre of Christian fiction which is very much about a good, faithful wife being a good homemaker and doing all these things, and this is seen as Christian fiction. I mean, it's a certain type of Christian fiction, but it's not really what I think we're looking for. I think that the point you're making is good, and that there are Christian writers. I mean, Marilyn Robinson, I think, is a very good example. And in fact, what's interesting about Marilyn Robinson is not merely that she's bringing her faith to bear on her fiction, it's that she's bringing a reformed version of the Christian faith to bear on fiction, and weaving in insights which very often you wouldn't get from, for example, an Anglican tradition. So she, in many ways, is a very good example of that. But if you look at where these people have come from, very often they are charismatic, intelligent individuals who fostered an individual vision, and there's kind of not a sort of support network or a sort of organizing network to really help people articulate a literary vision of the Christian faith. And I think that individuals do emerge from time to time. And Tolkien and Lewis were unusual in that they knew each other, and they kind of cross-referenced and cross-fertilized each other. But a lot of the people who we're talking about nowadays are solitary individuals. And the question really is there some way in which we could create an environment in which more of these fiction writers would flourish and support each other? Now, I think you cannot manufacture creativity. That's the problem. It just happens. But I feel sure there must be some way of helping people to express this and sustaining them as they try to develop their writing ministries. Certainly we need this very, very badly. But I'm not really sure what the answer is. Madeleine L'Engle is another example of someone who's very good. And again, she just seems to have kind of found her own way and arrived on the scene. So I would like to know what we could do, because there aren't enough of them. Thank you.
I have a question with regards to the biblical narratives. I think, most people living today, including myself, find it sometimes difficult to cope with the way that God is depicted in the Old Testament and the New Testament. The very stereotype picture is the wrath of God in the Old Testament, in the trials and all the very Jesus Christ, and these, could you just have a few comments on how we cope with the picture we sometimes receive from, for instance, the book of Jeremy, or where the wrath of God is so intense, and the way, can we find some constructive points in that when we approach our...
I think we have to be selective about the artists that we use. I mean, as you will know, I mean, biblical art is based partly on the text. It's also the way the artist chooses to interpret this and represent it. And so very often you'll find that a similar biblical passage is depicted in very different ways. And I think that you have a degree of choice here. You'll be able to say, I think this is a better one. I'm going with this one rather than with that one. So I think that we can begin to find a way of meeting our own personal needs here by finding pictures that we personally find really quite helpful. There is a very interesting project in Britain at the moment, it's based in Britain, which is called the Visual Theology Project. What it is basically, it's looking at a whole series of images that have been drawn with reference to certain biblical passages. And so what they are doing is they are visual commentary in Scripture. It's called visual commentary in Scripture. So there'll be a biblical passage, and then there'll be 3 different illustrations. And the idea is to help you to see how different artists have seen different things, and realize that actually you as an intelligent viewer have got to make a decision about which you think is the best, if I call this, visual exegesis of the text. And that's going on all the time. Artists are always interpreting and finding things there that maybe you and I would not, or representing things that are there in ways that you and I would find to be inappropriate. But I think that, there's a sense in which you and I can make some calls on this by saying that, as far as I'm concerned, is better than this. Because there's always this idea of interpretation, which very often reflects certain preconceived ideas about what these things ought to be like. Visual commentary on Scripture. You might find it helpful. Thank you.
Last question.
I'd also like to thank you for these great lectures. In one of the first lectures, you categorized some literature as junk literature, and maybe I'm wrong, but I guess that you made Christian literature as just always distinctive to junk literature. And with that, I'm getting afraid that you may make a social backlash, like because it's certain groups that uses this junk literature. Maybe you are opening doors with these great narratives, and maybe you're also closing it to other groups of people where you're not necessarily having read Narnia a lot.
Thank you. I think, talking about junk literature, I think I was talking about the kind of novels I would buy to read on a plane, which is basically just to pass the time. And very often I found myself surprised, actually it's better than I thought it was going to be, and I actually learned something through it. So really I was making no disparaging comments about literature as a whole. I was just saying that these kind of things you buy in airport bookshops to while away a long flight, and very often they're not very good. But I find them interesting because I'm trying to understand what it is about these that people like, and what does it tell me about the way the publishing industry is going, all these kind of things. So I'm using the word junk, a bit like in England, English would use the word junk press, meaning a kind of publications aimed at a particular audience where the idea is simply to give them something to read which will not improve them but will pass the time. And that's the kind of comment I was making. I wouldn't want to dismiss some better literature as junk at all. For me, junk is something I read on a plane.
Yes, let's give an